Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plot Lines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we're talking all things James II, the last Catholic king of England and Scotland. And with me to discuss this is Justine Brown, the author of a new book called The Private Life of James II. Welcome to the show. How you doing?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me on. Here we have all the James II merch here. This is the book, and there's the poster back there. We don't have the hats made up yet. But
there are hats?
No, not yet.
Okay.
There should be visors, mugs,
Indeed, yes. So, where did the idea of you writing this book come from? I'm curious.
There's been, I feel very fortunate. I have a YouTube channel called Justine Brown's Bookshelf. And in that, I focused a lot. I have a whole list on the Jacobites, who, just to, briefly summarize, that James II is the person who put the Jacobus, that means James in Latin, into Jacobitism. He is the original person around whom this movement is centered, because he is, when he was deposed in 1688, he was a legitimate king in terms of being the next in line to the throne. And so absolutely, he was, the reason he was deposed had more to do with his religious policy than anything else. And so when he was deposed, there were a lot of people who were scandalized by this, not just Catholics, but also Anglicans, who they may have disagreed with his Catholicism, but they, supported the tradition of the inherited throne. And so he had a lot of supporters, Catholic and Protestant, and they were known as Jacobites. And there were 3 generations of people who attempted to restore the legitimate line to the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland. So a lot of people have heard of Bonnie Prince Charlie. He, like an Outlander, for example, for people who might know that show. He was James's grandson, and his uprising, which the Jacobites had been living on the continent, but they landed in Scotland because they had a lot of support there. And then they made their way down to England. And unfortunately, things didn't go in their favor ultimately. But that was one of a series of uprisings in an effort to restore James's line to the throne. Oh dear. And then Bonnie Prince Charlie, Prince Charles Edward Stuart tried to restore them. So his brother was a cardinal, and he didn't have any children, and so the line actually died out at that stage. However, it was transferred to a line of cousins, and so there still is a Jacobite line today, which is currently the Duke of Bavaria, I believe, is his title, and it will go to a Prince of Liechtenstein after that. So there still is a claimant.
Yes. Now, but in the grand scheme of things, for you though, like, what interests you most about James?
Yes. So I was just going to say that I got very interested in the Jacobites because there's kind of an intersection there between what we might call broadly NRX, neo-reactionary thought, as described by people like Mencius Mollbug / Curtis Yarvin. Are you familiar with his work at all?
Yeah. Roughly, I've listened to a number of videos. I haven't read his work, but I'm listened to a lot of podcasts with him on it.
Yeah. So there's an interesting kind of intersection between his work, and I'll briefly explain why I say that mention him specifically, and between 17th century history, which was my specialty. and what I studied when I was in graduate school. I've written a few books in the past that broadly have to do with the kind of a critique of utopianism, and but I started this YouTube channel on 17th century history, got into the English Civil War, and James was the son of Charles I, who is the king who was executed. And so it was kind of a natural development that I was reading Moldbug, and he actually, in his blogs, he actually calls himself a Jacobite and talks about how, like, our present order is like based on the Dutch invasion. He makes these references that a lot of people, intentionally, he does this to try to kind of get out of the Democrat Republican binary that subsists in the United States, but there's a similar kind of structure in most Western countries, right, where you're kind of you're on this side or that side, essentially, terms dictated by the French Revolution, the left or the right side of the king. And he sort of tries to break that binary and can pull back and kind of say, like, what we are living in now is an outgrowth of Whig history. And the Whigs were the political party that were actually devoted to ousting James II. That was that was how the party system, a modern party system, developed. So there were Whigs and Tories. And of course, the Tories are still kicking around as the Conservative Party in England and in Canada. But the Whigs have died out now, but they were kind of the party of liberalism, broadly speaking, the sort of anti-tradition party, and the kind of Enlightenment party. And what happened was James was a brother of Charles II, the kind of merry monarch, as he was known. And Charles II didn't have any legitimate offspring. And so he had many illegitimate offspring, but no legitimate offspring with his wife, Portuguese Queen Catherine. And so James was his heir. Now, James converted to Catholicism, and this was a scandal for many in England in the 1670s. So there was a very strong anti-Catholic bias that persisted in England. Hilaire Belloc estimates that the Catholic population, around 10% at that time, and that kind of includes people who were iffy. They only a certain amount of people are really willing to go to the wall, that is, to be openly Catholic and suffer the consequences, which were quite severe at the time.
So, yeah, recusancy.
Exactly, yeah. To be a recusant essentially meant that you were not a practicing Anglican. There were, of course, a lot of other people who weren't practicing Anglicans, Protestant dissidents of one kind and another. And the Whig Party actually, they had more Protestant dissidents in them than Anglicans. The Tory Party were the party of the Anglicans. So it's quite one of the fascinating things about James is that the party system emerged around him. Up until that time, we really didn't have a party system per se. You had trends in Parliament, but not a kind of clear, identifiable party system. And it developed in tandem with media, with pamphlets and newspapers. So, the Whigs had their own pamphlets and newspapers, the Tories had theirs, and the purpose of the media, it becomes a lot clearer, especially when you read about it in the 17th century, that the purpose is really to herd the public, especially as the franchise expanded, and more people started getting the vote. The purpose of the media is to herd people in a certain direction, get them voting in a certain way. So yeah, it's interesting that James, when he was still the heir, he was the Duke of York. By the way, he is the one who New York is named for.
Yes,
He
indeed.
it's a nice detail, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and it was New Amsterdam, and because if I'm correct, the British Navy, which was more or less run by the Duke of York or created by the Duke of York, as it's known now, um, basically showed up at New Amsterdam and forced the Dutch to surrender New Amsterdam, and then hence it became New York.
That's right. And so, yeah, it was this Duke of York specifically who gave his name to New York. Yes, he was the Lord High Admiral at the time. And there had been 3 wars against the Dutch. He won this particular war. And so New Amsterdam was in sort of part of the settlement. And so, yeah, as they came along and said, right, we'll take this. This is a nice trading port. And James was given a map of New Amsterdam that he had in his office at Whitehall. So there's quite a strong link there. And then he also had other involvement with America in various ways. Like, for example, he was very close friends with William Penn, the famous Quaker who founded Pennsylvania. And James was the one who gave him the land to do that. And he also, when he was king, he was the one who tried to consolidate the New England colonies into one thing, which was very unpopular with a lot of people, but might have worked out. But since when James was deposed, that project fell apart. So
it's interesting that it's even still, we still refer to that area as New England, like
yes,
even though there's no state with such a title.
Yeah, a lot of Europeans think that there is a state called New England.
Well, it almost happened apparently.
Yeah, it would have been called. Well, it was briefly called the Dominion of New England, and I've actually gone into this colonial history quite a bit on my channel as well, and it's very apparent to me that the English Civil War was like, you see the English Civil War play out a couple more times in American history, because the Puritans brought, as most Americans still know, the Puritans, settled in the North, and they were the New Englanders. But the Royalists who supported King Charles were, broadly speaking, in the South. And so Virginia, Maryland, Georgia, Carolina, places like this. Georgia wasn't formed yet, but definitely Virginia and Maryland, they supported the king. And so you could see that cultural difference, that persisted, a sort of more agrarian, hierarchical kind of society in the South. And then, it actually played out in the American Civil War as well. So in a way, the American Civil War is like a kind of English Civil War redux.
Yeah. Sequel. Well, you mentioned Parliament, how it's sort of, part of it was these parties were being formed around and against James II. But also, isn't it sort of also part of it that Parliament is trying to assert its sovereignty over the king? So before, you wouldn't necessarily have different parties because the king was over all of them anyways.
Yeah. The efforts of Parliament to assert their sovereignty and to become sovereign, which they did do. I mean, they achieved that. And now, Parliament sovereignty in Britain is now passing, and I think, into a new phase where we have a lot of NGOs that probably that are, a lot more policy making power than Parliament itself. But in principle, Parliament is sovereign, right? The current
NGO and civil servant,
deep state kind of stuff,
sovereignty.
Yeah, and the king is a symbol. That we have the ceremony the king is an important ceremonial figure, and in principle, in theory, he has more power than he ever exercises. But when push comes to shove, like, I think one reason the royal family don't do that is that they're afraid that they would just kind of get thrown out altogether if they tried it. So in the 17th century, the story of how this came to be started during the English Civil War in the 1640s. And we have Parliament, the parliamentary faction, I like to insist, because it's a little too simple to say that it was just Charles versus the entire Parliament, because in fact, he had enough of Parliament that when he retreated to Oxford and started a kind of parallel capital, he took a huge amount of Parliament with him. So they had a second Parliament in Oxford with a second House of Lords. Of course, he had more supporters in the House of Lords, but he also had quite a lot of ordinary MPs as well. So you had the royalist and the sort of the kind of Puritan faction in Parliament, and that is the faction, the Puritan faction, led by Oliver Cromwell, eventually is the faction that won. But they didn't do it, these stories are often told like, oh, it's the beginning of democracy and blah, blah, blah. But
yes, the Cromwell movie.
It's a good thing. The Cromwell movie, exactly. Yeah. But the irony is that last scene where we have Cromwell in Parliament and the beginning of democracy, like, he had just finished kicking Parliament out of the chamber. So, Cromwell, I move in circles where there's, we're all friends, but we disagree about whether, about Cromwell and Charles I. Some people admire Cromwell just because he was an impressive, he was an impressive general. He was an impressive ruler. He imposed power. He imposed order when England was falling into chaos. However, he also led the charge to execute the king, and I think he can never be forgiven.
Yeah, destroying order to only assert your own order.
That's right. Yeah,
I'm not sure that's a very admirable thing at all.
No, exactly. Yeah, first it's like you create the crisis, and then you firefight it. So, if these people had, when you read back, and there's quite a good new book out about Charles I. It's called the Charles I Private Life, which is by Mark Turnbull. And he goes into a lot of the details leading up to the beginning of the English Civil War, and I think makes a good case that how that Charles I did his best in a very, very tricky situation. But we had a class that had been emboldened by the redistribution of the monasteries in the previous century. So another irony of the situation is that Henry VIII broke up the monasteries and redistributed the land and created this bunch of supporters by paying them off with new land. But he actually destroyed the monarchy eventually by doing that, because he gave land to this kind of rising class, and it's best explained by, I think, if people know the name Thomas Cromwell, he's actually Oliver Cromwell's great uncle. He was the person who was in charge of that policy for Henry VIII. And he got land in that deal. And as a result, his family became MPs, right? Because at that time, in order to be an MP, you had to be a landowner. And so you basically had this expansion of numbers and more people becoming MPs. And so the same class that kind of had benefited from this redistribution of land from, stolen from the monasteries, then kind of turned around and overthrew the king. So having destroyed one institution, the church in England, they then turned around and thought, well, let's loot the monasteries. No, it's Chesterton who pointed this out. G.K. Chesterton.
Yes,
he does say
the class that is basically, I mentioned this in I'm doing sort of a series on Hilaire Belloc's views on the Reformation, and I mentioned that Henry VIII's destruction of the monasteries created the class that will that was not just going to destroy the monarchy, but also going to destroy any basically hold England away from Catholicism.
Yeah, I think I saw that episode, actually. I thought this was going to tie in quite well because Henry VIII is a figure that comes up a lot in this story, and when it comes to James's own conversion, it had a lot to do with Henry VIII, as a matter of fact. So which we could come back to, but so just to go back to Parliament's power grab, believe that the monarchy was also in a bad situation financially going into that war. So it's always the problem of in order to raise money, you have to call Parliament. But when you call Parliament, then you run into all sorts of political problems, right? So if you can, in medieval times and in the 16th century, Parliament and the king didn't have this kind of really conflict ridden relationship the way it wound up in the 17th century. I'm sure they had their disagreements, but largely it was an advisory body, and more harmonious kind of model of Parliament and king relations. And that was the ideal, was that everybody worked together in harmony. Everybody had their place, right? But I think the 17th century is when we see the chickens come home to roost, right? And in a lot of different ways, because the church has been sort of smashed into smithereens, and the smithereens are manifesting in tiny little sects. The Quakers, the Shakers, the Muggletonians, the diggers, there's the ranters, that was another one. Just all these little tiny Protestant groups. So, it starts with the destruction, the sort of transition to a kind of broad form of Protestantism. Then we see the Puritans attempt to, but, not like Anglicanism in some ways is not especially hardcore Protestant, right? But then that's noticed by the Puritans, and they say, well, this isn't Protestant enough, so we have to purify the church of its Catholic vestiges, which is what Puritanism really means. But then you have within that, even like the Puritans, you have all these little subsets and groups that are all fighting with each other. Right? So it's entertaining in some ways, just because of all the strange, if people have seen the woodcuts from the time and the pamphlets, there's just this blizzards of pamphlets and tiny little groups all fighting with each other. And it's kind of interesting from from a distance. I'm sure it was pretty hellish to live through, though.
Yeah. Is this chaos part of the reason why Puritans end up in North America?
Yes. And they left at a time when they were not winning. They felt that they were being oppressed in England, and they wanted to practice in a certain way, and the Anglican Church was trying to force them to conform. Even the idea that we use the term conformist and nonconformist these days. So many of our terms that we use every day for political, to describe modern politics, is derived from church politics. Just for example, a cause, right? People talk about having a cause, people who are into whatever leftist, cause. That comes from the church, of course, for having a cause for sainthood. The conformism and nonconformism comes from this question over whether you were going to be a kind of standard Anglican, or whether you wanted to purify the Anglican Church, or whether you wanted to go off and break off and start your own little tiny group. So the Puritans who went to Massachusetts were independents who believed, like, or Congregationalists, some of them are called, like, where they think that every local church should be run by, as a separate government, essentially, right?
And were they called separatists, I think?
Yeah, that was in that. There are a lot of different terms. They're also known as the Brownists because they followed this one particular Robert Brown. So
Okay.
I feel like they should, I don't know, they should start following me maybe or something. But
Brown is following you, yes. But yes, and one of the great things about your book is I learned a bunch of little things that I would not get from pretty much anywhere else. And one of those things is you mentioned how the separate parliaments, how they sort of break off during the English Civil War, and I believe it's called the Royalists one is called the Cavalier Parliament.
yeah,
And that is, I don't think that's ever discussed like anywhere else, at least not in conventional circles.
the Cavalier Parliament is, that term is used for, more commonly it's used for the parliament that was assembled after Charles II was restored.
Oh,
So that, I mean, it was used like casually to describe the Oxford Parliament, the second one that we mentioned, and then because they were Cavaliers assembled there, so Cavaliers and Royalists are the same people. And for those who we want an image of this, it's like they're very much in the vein of the Three Musketeers kind of look. They were like dressed, with lots of sort of blousy satin finery, big long boots, long hair. There was this thing about they wore a love lock, which is like a long piece of hair with like a bow on it or something. And there were all sorts of pamphlet wars, just like fighting over that one detail.
like Puritans complaining about that.
Yeah. So because they were called the Puritans were called Roundheads because they had comparatively shorter hair.
Okay.
And there's like this, all sorts of ridiculous. And then this Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who was one of the royalist commanders, was James's older cousin. He was sort of the king of the Cavaliers, and he had this amazing white poodle, like a large hunting poodle called Boy. And they would put out pamphlets about Boy, claiming that Boy was a witch and stuff like this. So,
it's amazing how sort of fashion was very political.
Yeah, it was. That was it was your uniform, really. And interestingly, during the English Civil War, we actually get the first proper uniforms, but that was on the Puritan side. Cromwell created what's called the New Model Army, and once he did that, and it was partway through the English Civil War, that's when they won. Is that because the New Model Army they were very organized. They had uniforms. They were very drilled and very like very orderly, and that's when they started to win. Because at first they were losing. The king won the first few battles, but now James was a young boy during all this, and he was taken hostage when Oxford fell. He then was kept hostage for a few years, and Parliament were going to try to make a pocket king, is what they called it, that sort of have him get rid of Charles and put him in his father's place and have him as a puppet. And they were going to try that with him or his younger brother Henry. And so Charles, who was also imprisoned at that time, his father, he had an older brother, Charles, who told him, "You got to escape." So he managed to escape in disguise. and get to the continent. And then a very shocking thing happened, which is that Parliament, this actually tiny faction of Parliament, that decided to execute his father. And that was a huge shock that cannot be, like, for not just for him, but for everybody, for all of Christendom. It was a gigantic shock. And I think this can't be underestimated. I really think that England, I don't think England has ever truly recovered from this. By the way, for people who don't know, I live in England. I'm English Canadian, but I'm from Vancouver originally. But I've lived here for quite a long time, and you do see it. Broadly speaking, the population still is arguably divided into Roundheads and Cavaliers. There's kind of a, not it's not sort of just like a perfect one-to-one equivalence, but you still have these two traditions that are very that, like, the Roundhead sort of Puritan tradition is more, broadly speaking, more Republican, which means not monarchist, right? Not traditionalist.
And getting rid of hierarchy and
Yeah,
that sort of thing.
They're egalitarians.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the Tories are more hierarchical, but I mean, they've sort of been basically swallowed up by a new version of hierarchy.
They've been swallowed up by liberalism, and it's more, like modern hierarchical, oligarchical form. So, I mean, the Tories have survived over the years by just taking on whatever set of policies they think will get them into power, and they started copying the Whigs in the late 18th century, and that's really how they've survived as long as they have. I mean, they're in a very decrepit state, at the moment, and we wonder, like, whether if they recover, what form they'll take. They are the oldest political party in the world, and they do have these respectable origins, from my point of view, in that they were James's supporters. By the way, Whig and Tory were both insults to start off with. They both basically mean cattle rustler or bandit or something, and they're both Gaelic words. So
it's kind of like in America, a Republican is an elephant, and a Democrat is a donkey.
Donkey.
Both were insults, but both now just are used by the parties themselves, more or less.
It's quite a common thing, isn't it? Like, you hear it's the same with I don't know, movements in art. For example, Impressionism. That was an insult to start off with. It came from a bad review, like reviewer was saying, "Oh, this stuff is so blurry. It's like Impressionism. It's just an impression of stuff. It's horrible." And now it's one of the most popular types of art. But yeah, so they each had an insult for each other. They each called each other bandits, and then it just sort of stuck. So the Tories, they have this. They have this kind of respectable origin of these legitimist, traditionalist supporters of monarchy, in that they were James's original supporters. So they supported legitimism, meaning like the legitimate monarch who gains, his legitimacy through descent, and not through being like, sort of popular sovereignty or something like that. But it's like goes back to this deep tradition, right? And so
they did abandon him, though.
They did, yeah. So eventually it turned into Tories versus Jacobites, and that's where the Jacobite Party were like the subset of the Tories that supported James. So,
what was the sort of the remnants of that look like? What was that? That must have been a very small group of people, right?
The Jacobites,
like at least in power.
Yeah, there's a very interesting book called Jacobitism and the English People, which I'm reading right now. And it's particularly intriguing because, like, a lot of people nowadays, if they know about the Jacobites, they think of it as something to do with Scotland and maybe Scottish nationalism or something like that. Like or people think that Bonnie Prince Charlie was fighting to, like, take to win the throne of Scotland from England or something, or something Scotland.
Basically a Braveheart.
Yeah. So, yeah. Or they think it's something to do, like he was trying to someone said the other day, oh, Bonnie Prince Charlie wanted to reinstate Catholicism in the British Isles. That's not what he was fighting for. I mean, he was a Catholic, but he was fighting for his line to be reinstated to the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland, right? So it was his family, his father, that he wanted to stack on the throne. So, but it was kind of it was by definition an underground movement. It had a lot of support from, well, Catholics, but also Protestants who liked James II's model of religious. They liked his religious policy better. And let me explain this. So James converted in the early 1670s, and he converted because he read a book about the Protestant Reformation. And this book was written by an Anglican, and little did he know his book was going to have such an effect on the heir to the throne. But it described Henry VIII's reasons for breaking with the church, and in detail. And I'm not sure what he would have probably had a vague idea, but this book went into it in detail, talking about Anne Boleyn, his relationship with his original wife, Catherine of Aragon, his daughter, how his daughter Mary was put to one side, then also about the dissolution of the monasteries. And so James, who was this very kind of, I don't know, just like logical, straightforward person, he said, so this huge, upheaval in British, in the British Isles was basically brought about because this man was lustful towards this woman. Yeah, he wanted to get a male heir, but that was like he thought of it as an unchristian way of trying to get a male heir, sort of forcing God's hand, right? Yeah. And also greedy. Greed was another thing that he identified. And because James himself his particular Achilles heel was women. Like he was quite a lustful fellow. He had a series of affairs. He was very aware of this as being like a weak spot in his character. And so when he read about Henry, he just kind of, how when someone has like your same like if someone has a tendency to sin the way that you sin, it's very obvious to you, right? Like, if, I mean, I find that, like, if you see somebody who has your own kind of weaknesses, right? It's you just see like, and it kind of disgusts you as well, right?
Yeah,
it's like
you don't like those people. You usually surround yourself with people that don't have your own weaknesses. Unless you're indulging in them, then you might.
Right, unless you're indulging in them, yeah. So you're kind of, you find it kind of really icky in other people because you don't like it in yourself, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So James, that's what happened. James like read about Henry, and he just thought, well, this guy is I see right through this guy. And he thought that Henry's reasons for breaking with the Church of Rome were very poor, and he would have actually had more respect for that if Henry had a principled kind of set of Protestant beliefs or something. But we know that Henry didn't have a principled set of Protestant beliefs. Like, he wasn't really a natural Protestant at all. In fact, he had been awarded Defender of the Faith because of a tract that he wrote against Martin Luther. And even when he broke with Rome, he still kept on most of the forms of Catholicism, right?
Yeah,
So
even
James just
even he what is it called? The eight, like, isn't there like a certain number of precepts or something that Henry VIII puts forward?
Oh, I'm not aware of that, but were they you mean the changes that he made? Because he did make a few changes, didn't he?
No, these weren't changes. These were just like rules to to follow, of what we believe, of what they believe, and they pretty much all of them were very Catholic elements.
Right.
I believe Stephen Gardner was the one who wrote it, and it was approved by Henry VIII. But I can't remember. It was like a certain number of beliefs. I can't. But
So
anyways, it's
he,
very
he
Catholic stuff.
yeah, I mean, he still subscribed to, he had a sacramental view. Um, Unfortunately, I don't know what I think his position on Our Lady might have changed somewhat, because I know he certainly attacked some of her shrines. So I'm not, that'd be an interesting question I'm talking about Henry here, that
Yes.
he went to Walsingham to pray for a son. When he didn't get one, he basically destroyed the shrine. But yeah, that would be something interesting to look into, what he, eventually what his position was.
Well,
But
my theory, at least, is just that he didn't actually change belief in any capacity. He just used things as they
yeah,
came in order, whatever benefited his sort of desires at any certain position.
yeah, no, I agree with you. I think he at his core, he's still, it was only, he would never have changed anything if he hadn't have, if it hadn't have so happened that he, fell in passion with Anne Boleyn, and she kind of turned him down, and that got him fired up, and so, like, just one thing led to another, and he just kept insisting that, I mean, that but he insisted, on getting this woman and marrying her, and then within 1 year he cut her head off. It was, really, like, after all that time insisting that this woman was his great love and blah blah blah, right? He destroyed her completely in 1 year. And the whole question of how guilty she was or wasn't, nowadays everybody wants to say that she wasn't guilty, but there is one historian who fairly recently wrote a book arguing that there was some substance to the claims that Anne Boleyn was an adulteress. But anyway, that's not really anything to do with Henry's reasons for leaving the church. But so
Well, so
James,
I just want to bring up the
mhm,
the six articles.
right,
The transubstantiation,
hmm,
that the view that you did not need to receive both the host and blood,
right,
both
under
kinds, basically,
both
under both kinds,
species. Yeah,
both
yeah,
species. Yeah, the obligation of priests to remain celibate, uh, the binding character of the vows of chastity, the uh, the existence of private masses, and confession.
okay. Those are all, yeah, very
I,
affirming Catholicism. Of course, it was his son who was more of a true Protestant, but then he didn't live all that long. So.
yeah, influenced uh, by Seymour, by
Edward Seymour, yeah,
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 Edward Seymour. But yeah,
yeah.
so this influenced James into seeing sort of through the sort of the weak arguments for the creation of the Church of England and the break with Rome.
That's right. And then so he simply said, "Oh, okay, right. Well, I'm a Catholic then." I mean, it just, and then he gave he gave this book to his then wife, whose name was Anne Hyde, and she read the book, and then she converted to Catholicism, and then she wrote a tract and a manuscript anyway, and circulated it at court, and there were quite a lot of high profile conversions. The court tended to be fairly Catholic friendly. It was more Parliament that was dominated by by Protestants and hardcore Protestants at that.
With you mentioned Parliament being dominated by hardcore Protestants, did Parliament like reform, like merge back the two, the Royalist Parliament and the sort of the Oliver
Puritan.
Cromwell Parliament, or the Parliamentary Parliament?
So after the 11-year period of republicanism, or whatever it was, that after, when Cromwell ruled, and he ruled until about 1658, and then he died, and then his son attempted to take over, but that never really worked out. So then they invited Charles II to come back, and then suddenly, James and Charles were, their life had been really quite difficult for the last 10 more years, and they suddenly rode into England, and their lives were suddenly wonderful, right? Everything, people were throwing petals in their path, and everyone was thrilled to have them back, it seemed. And so there was a new, the next one was the official Cavalier Parliament that then came into being, and it was dominated by the supporters, of the Royalists, dominated for the next while, like at least for the 1660s, they dominated. But and the former enemies of the royal family attempted to kind of, they downplayed their kind of position. So the deal was that if the king came back, he said he would not punish anyone except for the regicides, that is, the people who had signed the death warrant. And so he made this deal, and so it was initially kind of, they tried to be very kind of friendly, and it was all about unity, at least from the royal family's point of view. I mean, they definitely pursued, they executed whatever of the 59 regicides were still around. Some of them escaped to New England. Some of them had died already, and some of them escaped to Switzerland. But apart from that, they tried to be kind of conciliatory, except that they punished them culturally by being as sort of being kind of outrageous, like lascivious, self-indulgent, kind of. This is where the image of the Restoration kind of comes about, is that the Cavaliers and the royal family are sort of, dancing on the grave a little bit of the Puritans, and just kind of trying to wind them up by being as anti-Puritan as possible, right? So, and in Parliament, the Cavalier Parliament were a bit more hardcore on their enemies than the king wanted. But by the 1670s, the sort of the Puritans Mark II started to assert themselves, and the occasion for this was James's conversion. So when James, they'd always been kind of accusing the royal family of crypto Catholicism, of being secret Catholics. And of course, when James converted, there were rumors, and at first he was quite secretive about it for his brother's sake, but they forced his hand by essentially introducing a thing called the Test Act, which meant that for any position of power, or even to attend a university, you had to testify, you'd make an oath that rejecting transubstantiation.
Which, as we just discussed, Henry VIII had in his sixth article. Yeah. It's just kind of funny how that changes.
It is weird, because James made this point too. He said, I thought Anglicans were supposed to accept transubstantiation, but but apparently not, right? At least according to your Test Act. So it seemed to me that the Anglicans were always a bit waffly on this question,
Well, isn't Anglicanism just kind of waffly? Like
It is waffly.
it's just it kind of doesn't know what it is. You know,
Yeah,
it nowadays it tries to be more or less whatever, so, to some degree at least,
yeah.
whatever people want
The
it to
world.
be.
Yeah, it's very world. I see it as quite worldly. They tend to like the trappings. I say tend to because there are factions in the Anglican Church today that are like the low church ones that are more sort of Protestant,
Hmm.
in their tastes. But the higher church ones tend to love the trappings, like love the beauty, but they don't actually the actual principles. They actually seem to find it embarrassing, to be sort of actually believe in Christianity. They find that a little embarrassing or something. So um, the exception to this is I think Anglo Catholics, who are like the most high church of the Anglicans, and I do find that a lot of those people are quite sincere believers. Um, I every January 30th I attend a service for Charles I because that's the day that he was executed, and there's a beautiful service that happens at the Spot, which is the banqueting house in Whitehall. It's a beautiful room where Charles used to, he had it wonderfully decorated by Rubens, and they basically bring in an altar, and there is this Anglo-Catholic um, club, or not club, like society dedicated to Charles I, and it's
Yeah,
Society of King Charles Martyr. Maybe you've heard of them.
yeah, I
King
have heard
Charles
of it.
Martyr. So they view Charles I as a martyr,
Hmm.
and this actually goes back to the Civil War period. A lot of people viewed Charles as a martyr. I think the only argument, I mean, personally, I think there's an argument to be made that Charles I mean, I think he was a very sincere Anglican, but he did remain in one of the reasons that he favored, like, whether he, for example, he wanted to keep bishops because the other Protestants wanted to abolish the bishops, was that there was a bridge to Catholicism, a potential bridge to reunifying with the Catholic Church, and he also corresponded with the Pope about this. So there is evidence that Charles wanted an eventual reunification between Anglican and Protestant Catholic churches. So, you could argue that he was a kind, that would be the basis you know, of the case for him being a martyr in the fullest sense, is that
Yeah,
he died to preserve this possibility, I guess. That's,
yeah.
you know,
Charles Colonial makes the argument that he never called himself a Protestant. He was trying to preserve the hierarchy, and it was before the Pope had declared the orders of Anglican bishops and priests to be nullified, more or less. So, there's a possibility of his understanding that it
mhm.
was more or less in line, with the possibility that he could be considered a Catholic saint in the future, depending
Yeah,
on.
it's an
Uh,
interesting thing because, like, he did see himself as just like his wife was Catholic,
mhm.
and there was a lot of political hay made out of this. That the Puritans thought that Charles was, again, a crypto Catholic. I think that in his mind there were certain things that had to be achieved before such a reunification could happen. So he didn't just see himself as a Catholic in the waiting exactly, but he did think that if X, Y, and Z happened, that maybe a reunification could occur down the road. So it's a little like, it's
It's
because
like Anglicanism, a little waffly.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like
Um,
sort
well,
of.
like people. This is what kind of gets me frustrated when like people like Carl Benjamin refers to England as like a Protestant country, as like in whole, like because he always says like if he ever became a Christian, if he became a believing Christian, he would just become a Protestant. But not, but which is kind of funny because he just says that he'd become a Protestant because he's English, even
And English
though
people are
if
Protestant.
he actually started believing in Christianity, he'd actually have to commit to certain beliefs, and then he'd have to figure out what those beliefs were, and that doesn't necessarily mean you become a Protestant. It's
Yeah.
but anyways, but this whole battle, even amongst Anglicans, that I would say goes all the way up to at least the Oxford movement,
Yeah.
and in a real lesser degree now, but there is this still battle within Anglicanism of for a more Catholic like sacramental system, or
Yes.
a Protestant system of
Yeah.
church. So how can you really say that England is a purely Protestant country? If anything, it's like in a civil war with itself continuously.
I think he has. I mean, it's like on the bright side, I think he's closer now than he ever was, like more friendly to Christianity than he was in the past, because before he used to just be like, an out and out atheist.
Mhm,
And now he hangs around with Reverend Calvin Robinson,
mhm,
who I quite like. And by the way, so at this yearly service for Charles I, which I attend, and just they have like a they have it's a very respectful service, and um, of course I sit out the sacrament part, but like just attend to be respectful towards Charles. He was there the last two times, so I think that he's quite dedicated to that, at least to that. It's nice to see that he's dedicated. Not Carl,
Calvin.
but Calvin Robinson. Yeah, that he's quite dedicated to that, to King Charles. So I think that's a good sign.
Yeah, but yes, he's Carl Benjamin's now much more friendly with Christians, and supportive of Christianity reviving itself, but he just doesn't believe himself. But it seems to me that the history doesn't really play out the idea that England
Yeah,
is a
this.
Protestant country inherently.
Yeah, no, it doesn't make sense, and he should know better as well, because he knows something about ancient history. And the thing is, like a lot of this Whig history, you know, um, kind of perspective is odd, because a lot of them they'll talk about things like, oh, our English tradition based in Magna Carta, blah blah blah. Well, Magna Carta was achieved in a medieval, Catholic world, right? These things that they refer back to that are, essential, the essential, like, traditions of England, um, they're medieval traditions, so it's not like they were brought about under a Protestant order. And and as you say, it's, although there have been like a minority of kind of various types of Protestant sects, like the dominant type of Christianity is very Catholic. And I think Theo Howard, makes that case quite well. I believe there's at a conference, there was a presenter who calls himself Panama Hat. Do you ever come across this person?
No, I don't. I've never talked to him, but I've listened to a lot of his stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a very nice person. Like I would say, kind of like a, I don't know, Chestertonian sort of. He has a Chestertonian kind of vibe about him, a little bit the way that.
He's got a great
Um,
voice.
yeah, he has a really nice voice. He does wear a Panama hat. I've seen him once or twice. But
Good to know.
he went to a conference where, um, Carl Benjamin was in the audience and made the case that the way forward was through the TLM, and that's where, how England should kind of pull itself, back together. And at that time, Carl objected that this was like foreign and was never going to, it was blah, blah, blah. But it was just, to him, that was just not English. And, I mean, England was Catholic for like, what was it, like at least 1,000 years before,
Yeah, well, they'll dispute, like, they tend to dispute, like, Alfred the Great.
And say he wasn't really
yeah, like, because he had the Bible translated into
that makes
that makes him a Protestant, like, that he wanted them to read the Bible, which is which is just sort of based on Protestant propaganda that Catholics aren't supposed to read the Bible. Most of the problems with the translations of Bibles are the translation themselves, not the fact that they've been translated.
Yes, yeah.
In the Reformation days, a lot of those translations were just heretical, and that's why they were, tried to be squashed.
And that's why the Douay-Rheims Bible has been it was made before, that translation was made before the King James version. I believe it had a big influence on it as well.
I think there was one that was made before, and then one that was made like an alteration of it.
A Catholic translation?
Yes, like, because there's because I think there was maybe the Dewey version, and then there's the Douay-Rheims version, which was in the 1700s, which was
is that the Challoner? I think Bishop Challoner.
Challoner edition.
Yeah, he's the one sort of single-handedly kept the Catholic tradition going through one of its most fallow periods, which was the 1700s.
Yeah. So with James, back to James and the Test Act, what was the results of that situation?
So the result was that he resigned his offices as Lord High Admiral and Commander of the Army, and that was very, very difficult for him because he'd been Lord High Admiral, at least officially, since he was 4 years old, about, and he was a extremely serious and talented soldier and sailor. And so that was hard for him, but he still was at his brother's right hand. It was interesting because Charles actually was Catholic-minded himself, Charles II, and he had made a treaty with Louis XIV, who was their first cousin, that he would convert at a point in the future. And Louis, at one point, he was very intent on doing so, and Louis was going to supply them with the forces that they would need in order to keep the peace if he were to do this. And Charles talked about taking the nation back into the Catholic Church wholesale, which a lot of people don't realize. Like, he's usually depicted as this nihilistic person, but he wasn't at all. But he was a very talented, like, Charles was a very skillful politician. He was a survivor. He was very good at keeping on the throne and keeping alive. James was maybe a little more sincere than was good for him in some respects. Like, he was in terms of, so he's just like, well, this is obviously silly, so I'm a Catholic now, and well, I can't really, I just have to be what I am. And so Charles was very different. He wanted James to be more like him. But so the two brothers were different in character, but very close and very dedicated to each other. And James remained at Charles's right hand, and he was very very diligent person, very conscientious, and so this would have gone on fairly peacefully if it were not for a thing called the Popish Plot and hoax, which occurred in 1678, and there were two madmen who made this claim that there was a Catholic plot to kill the king, and the claims shifted a lot, but essentially it came down to that Catholics were going to kill Charles and put James in his place, and they accused everybody of. It was a bit like the way, I don't know, the Salem witch trials or something is represented to us, a period where two kind of fantasists were accusing everybody, and people were getting executed left, right, and center. Many priests were executed, Catholic lords were executed. It was, and James felt this obviously very deeply, because he realized that, in a way, this is because he had made this public kind of declaration, and that now all the, people were extremely paranoid about Catholics. They blamed the fire of London on Catholics. I mean, everything was, everything that went wrong. It should be like, London is a very special case in England, because everything political sort of happened in London. It didn't necessarily reflect the rest of the country, because the rest of the country, there were big parts of England that were extremely Catholic in their kind of orientation. Like the North was still quite Catholic. Certain parts of the West were still quite Catholic. But London, because Parliament was there and is there, had this weird relationship between Parliament and the mob, and Parliament would, like, people in Parliament who were very worried about James's conversion. And a part of it was they had this, because they came from this class of people who had become powerful because of this land that they got from the monasteries. They had this, like, anxiety that persisted over the generations, that they would lose it, if there were a return to Catholicism. So even though, say, when Mary the First was queen, so-called Bloody Mary, she never made a move to restore Catholic lands, not in her lifetime anyway. And yet they had this ingrained fear that that everything that they had was kind of based on this state of affairs, right? So they had
this plot first, just to go back to the plot. The plot seems ridiculous unto itself. They've argued that Charles II is a crypto-Catholic, but the Catholics would also want to kill him and replace him with James II. Those things don't make sense, especially because James II doesn't have an heir.
Right. Well,
except for James II. He doesn't have a son,
He doesn't have a son. He had two daughters from his first wife who had been brought up Protestant, Mary and Anne. And they'd been brought up Protestant at Charles's insistence, because
you're talking about James's kids.
No, yeah, they were James's kids.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So James had these two daughters. Charles had said, we have to raise them Protestant, because he was always trying to, like, appease this parliamentary faction, right? So he would, and when it came time to marry off the older one, Mary, he married her to William of Orange, the Protestant, extremely Protestant Dutch leader, instead of the French Dauphin, which was the alternative, because again, he was trying to appease this faction. So he had this, like, he was always balancing Holland and France as these two, like, possible, countries to make treaties with and form alliances with. But if he got too close to one, then Parliament would get all lathered up, right? And that's what happened, is that they would freak out every time he got too close to the French. So he kind of tried to favor, even though they were having wars with the Dutch the whole time, But it is weird,
Yeah,
but
it's nonsense. It just feels like our politics today.
yeah,
The sort of nonsensical nature of it, no consistency.
yeah,
Um, it,
hysteria, yeah.
why did James allow his daughters to be brought up Protestant?
It just came down to his loyalty to Charles, and basically his principle was that the king, I'm the king's first servant. The the king said so, and therefore they're going to be brought up Protestant. So he
Why
wasn't
not
happy.
like Anglo Catholic?
Well, I guess I shouldn't say. I mean, they were Anglicans. They were Anglicans. Yeah,
but like,
I
why
should.
didn't they have like? Because it seems like Mary and Anne, they both would succeed to James, but
Yeah,
neither of them made any um, move towards Catholicism. If they had even a similar belief system to James II or Charles II, they would
yeah.
have theoretically still made the move. Is that because more of a I don't know, more of a problem with them being women as well, sort of
Yeah,
with
that's
their
also
with marriages and stuff like that, or
yeah, that's also a factor because they ended up both being married to men who were more emphatically Protestant, like more Calvinist.
okay.
Um, and the thing is that with the royal family, you had these separate households. So partly as a security measure, they would bring up their children in totally separate households. And so the daughters were both raised at Richmond Palace, which is a little quite further west in London, and and it was Charles who was kind of calling the shots, and he did think he seemed to think that the best way, was to, and they were Anglican, yeah, they weren't Calvinist, but um, they were sort of the people in charge of their education were Anglican bishops, and the same people were trying really hard to reconvert James. They would come over and argue with him and present, and say, how could you're the son of Charles the First. He died for the Anglican Church. How could you do this and stuff like that? And uh, they sort of built this kind of like silo around these two mentally,
Mm-hmm.
and Anne, I mean, James never, he was actually quite subtle. Like he would just sometimes give them reading, but he would never actually try to argue them out of their Protestantism himself. Now, the difficulty is with like heirs to the throne, because they were, despite being women, they were like the only game in town until the big event happened, which is that James did eventually have a son. That a kind of courts form around these people because of, people know that they're likely to inherit, so they start
Mm-hmm.
attracting these kind of courtiers, and people trying to push them in a certain direction. So they were like always seemed to be surrounded by like extremely sort of Protestant minded types, even within the Anglican fold. So
Yeah.
and they were both fairly, I would call them both fairly prejudiced, as well, even though they loved their father. And he was known as a very, very, like affectionate and doting father.
And
More,
their mother was Catholic too.
yeah, and their mother was Catholic too. Yeah, it's
Like,
weird. Yeah, how they were.
do you think this is one of sort of James II's fatal flaw, kind of, even
That,
more than sort of some of his other criticisms of him, that he wasn't pragmatic enough, but like this, because it seems like to me, from a with 2020
mhm.
vision, you basically set up yourself to be supplanted.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's true because yeah, um it's kind of weird because when he eventually so he married for a second time, and he married this Italian princess called Mary of Modena, who, by the way, I'm now working on a book about her. She's the only England's only Italian princess, and from an extremely interesting family as well, the D'Estes, who were a family of saints, warriors, great patrons, really impressive family. And that's like they're it's not really discussed usually when people talk about her as this credible family that she came from. But so like just in terms of her, I think after James was deposed and they went over to France, and they had the Jacobite court, and she became this kind of, and especially after James died, she was like the essentially in charge of all this Jacobite movement, not all of the strategizing and everything, but she was definitely their symbol, the person that the sort of flame that they gathered around, and
their patroness.
Their patroness and their sort of inspiration, and she and a lot of interesting. The Jacobite court in exile is a very interesting place, and it was extremely. It was not at all a done deal when James was deposed. For the whole 1690s, he seemed to be on the verge of getting reinstated for a long time, because people were actually kind of unhappy with William of Orange because he was perceived as a foreigner. Well, he was a foreigner,
The Dutch coup.
The Dutch coup, and he was he really, it's very clear that he only wanted to be the King of England so that he could use England's resources against the French, because the Dutch and the French were fighting in the especially over Flanders the whole time, and so he wasn't really interested in England at all. He brought he was sort of surrounded himself with Dutch people, and there was a lot of pressure exerted on the English, especially when it came to voting to actually, voting that James was formally kind of kicked off the throne. There were Dutch troops in Parliament when that vote went down, which they were essentially everyone was intimidated, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of reasons to not like William of Orange, and so there was a lot of sympathy for James, and so it wasn't cut and dried at all. But there was the Popish Plot, sort of finally, after all this nightmarish time with people getting executed left, right, and center, all of a sudden it kind of became clear that the whole thing had been fake. And suddenly the public just got bored of that. And it is like you say, it is like today, you have this kind of current thing vibe. There's hysteria, there's the media is in an uproar. They would have these anti-Catholic parades and burning the Pope in effigy, and just this, sort of froth that they were in, that went on and on. But then they kind of, they just kind of lost interest.
Yeah.
And all these people were dead, right? And it was eventually the people who made the accusations kind of said, "Oh well, all right, we weren't really,
don't worry about it.
Let's move on. Moving on.
What it's sort of like the nothing's happening, or this isn't happening. Oh no, it's happening, but it's good."
But
but it's a good thing.
I mean, you really do. I think this period is it really is the foundation of our current order in a lot of ways, like the way that party politics works, the way the media works, to inform the public and the vote, essentially propagandize them. And that's very clear in what happened with James and when his son was born. So he did take the throne. It actually went fairly well at first.
Well, actually, I think, Justine, maybe we should, we've already been going for an hour and 20 minutes. I
Okay.
think maybe if you're up for it, I think maybe we might have to do a second
Part
episode,
two.
a
Yeah,
part 2,
absolutely. Yeah.
about mainly James's reign.
Yes.
Because we
Lots.
covered a lot of background and a lot of his history and stuff like that, and I think this has been absolutely wonderful. So I think one on his reign will be perfect.
Okay, that's great. I'd look forward to that.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for watching. Uh, uh, Justine's book for Americans is coming out on the 30th. It's already out in Britain. Please, I will have a link in the description. Go out and buy it. James II is a really interesting character that is more or less abandoned, probably because he is also a servant of God
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
Catholic Church. There's possibility of his sainthood going
Mhm.
forward in the future, and I think we're supposed to avoid certain people, certain characters of history, because they're not within the realm that those who manage the media and stuff like that would not want us to pay attention to.
Exactly, like the character Mary the First, Charles the First, and James the Second are always like they always are referred to. They're stubborn. They're just not quite because they're not on board with the progressive kind of Whig history movement. Where we're going towards this present order, which is so great, and everything that helps us kind of take these steps towards this current wonderful order that we're in should be celebrated. And anybody who seem to be getting in the way of it should be like ignored and overlooked and dismissed.
Yeah, they're either ignored or vilified.
Yeah.
Yep. So if they can't avoid ignoring them, they'll just vilify them. But thank you, Justine. As I said, check out for everyone listening, check out her book as well as her YouTube channel. I will have links to that in the description as well. And God bless everyone.